So I think I can safely say that Chöd is a truly radical practice. Even within the rich variety of esoteric practices in the Vajrayana of Tibetan Buddhism, it stands out. There's a great quote Sarah Harding has from Machig's complete explanation that points to this. Whatever one may say of the deep spiritual techniques and psychic truths mysteriously at work in tantric practice can be said all the more of Chöd. With a stunning array of visualizations, song, music, and prayer, it engages every aspect of one's being and effects a powerful transformation of the interior landscape. It is far from watching the breath. So, what makes it really radical, in my view, apart from all the other compelling aspects of chopping up our bodies, ejecting our consciousness, and so forth, what makes it really radical is it forces a complete reliance on the vast and spacious nature of our minds. There are no half measures in this practice. In other words, if we think of sitting meditation, the objective is to experience the realization of the nature of mind and to stabilize that. That's the objective. But on the way there are other benefits, such as you could be meditating just for stress relief or to calm the mind. Not so in Chöd. Something that is as counterintuitive as ejecting your consciousness through the fontanelle of your head, proceeding to chop up your body and then feeding it to evil beings, has to work with something more transcendental than just calming the mind. In other words, the realization, or the pursuit at least, of the realization of the nature of mind is exactly what this practice is all about. And it's almost like you cannot practice this practice without really working with that. It's almost like it puts to the test the theory of emptiness, that which is, of course, at the core of Buddhism. This is really going out there and sitting and inviting the scary beings to come, and then cutting through and working with that duality and cutting through that duality. I also think it is a particularly relevant practice right now in our time, with the extreme polarization that we are experiencing. Charlotte and I keep having these conversations about constructive ways of working with this extreme polarity. And I really think Chöd can play a role in that, simply because it specifically works with duality and with cutting through that. So I think it's very helpful potentially and relevant for our times. So I want to proceed with just giving an outline of the main components of the practice for contextual reasons. And very shortly, of course, we'll go into this in depth during the course of the weekend, and even more tonight. But the sitting, the beginning of the practice, the sitting is really a feast. And to this feast, we invite all these different beings, basically 4 classes of beings that run the gamut from enlightened beings and teachers to harm doers, karmic debt holders, so-called demons. Once we've invited them to the feast, we proceed to eject our consciousness out of the fontanelle of our heads. And our consciousness manifests as a deity, trauma, who's really a representation of that which cannot be represented, which is the very essence, the very ground of being, the nature of mind. But she's wrathful in this manifestation. And as trauma, we then proceed to cut up our bodies, chop it up, and through an alchemical transformation, our body parts transform into a delectable feast. And we then offer that to our guests. And they partake of that feast to satisfy their needs. And then, after the feast, we dissolve and we rest in that completion. So those are the main outlines of the practice. And we'll unpack it, obviously, more during the course of this evening and the weekend. So Chöd, as a practice, has survived for over 1,000 years. It was seen to have been established in the 11th century by Machig Labdron. And it's practiced in every single lineage of Tibetan Buddhism, which is kind of unique for a practice. It doesn't belong to any one of those lineages. So what is it that makes this practice so compelling and that contributed to its surviving over all this time? And I think one of the key things is Machig Labdron, the woman who is seen as the progenitor or the founder of this practice. And because she was a fascinating character who lived in the 11th century. She was a woman, she was a mother, which at the time, in the culture where, the religious culture at least, was very patriarchal, that in itself was pretty unique. But in addition to that, she was the first person who established a uniquely Tibetan Buddhist lineage. Because of course, Buddhism came from India. And all the masters came from India. And she was someone who started teaching this practice and others, teachings on severance specifically. And this whole lineage came from that. Another aspect that makes it so compelling is the aspect of complete absorption. So it's an excellent example of the skillful means of the Vajrayana, in that it completely engages and preoccupies all of so many different faculties of our psyche, our body, and so forth. We are maintaining an ever-evolving, complex visualization, first of all. As we're doing this, we are singing ancient melodies. At the same time, we are drumming with a drum, and we are belling? It doesn't really work, right? What does that word? Ringing. We're ringing the bell. It's kind of like this thing, right? Where you, and hopefully we're doing that, on the same beat as everyone else. And then as we're doing that, sometimes even dance. We're not going to require dancing, notwithstanding the disco ball. But there are Chöd practices that actually also incorporates dance, choreographed dance movements. So you're doing all of the above, plus you're also dancing a specific choreographed set of movements. So it gets very complex. So it demands such extreme focus on hopefully all of those, but at least one or two of those elements, that it's really very difficult to be distracted and to be thinking of other things. And then as we're doing all of this, right, spinning all these plates, suddenly, bam, it stops. And we dissolve everything. And we rest. And in that contrast, there can be tremendous power as well. Sarah Harding talks about our fascination with the macabre in her book. And and she has this great paragraph, which I'm going to read in a moment. But I think there's also the fascination of our own death, our own demise. And this practice, working with that so directly, that in itself is a compelling aspect. Sarah Harding says, whatever it is about gruesome dissections, bloody sacrifice, human dismemberment, and ravenous demons that strikes a deep chord in the human psyche is purposely evoked in Chöd. It aims for the deepest, most hidden level, and in it lies its power and appeal. It is, as Machig so often says, unlike other Dharma systems. So that's a great quote to demonstrate that. And then finally, I want to reference the shamanic influence. I think it's fairly obvious that it has very strong shamanic aspects or influences. And it is thought that the Bön tradition influenced it directly in Tibet and other local shamanic practices. And so common elements that one can find all over the world in shamanic cultures, for example, dismemberment, which is a key element, drumming or working with drums, working with human bones, even the ejecting consciousness is something that is found in those traditions. So I think there's a very clear influence of the shamanic. And in doing research, I found a source that said that prior to the adoption of Chöd in Tibet, they used to cremate their dead. But after Chöd became common, they started with sky burial. I don't know if those of you don't know about the Tibetan practice of sky burial, where they chop up the corpse and then offer it to vultures. So that's not confirmed that is a fact, but it's one theory that or someone, a source that claimed that. And I think for the purpose of tonight's conversation, we'll look at the practice of Chöd, sort of first looking at the ejection of the consciousness portion, and then looking at the body offering piece. And Charlotta will talk more about that.
So what I'd like to start with actually is this non-dual view that Pieter started by talking about, because that's really the basis of all of Chöd. The reason we're doing Chöd in the first place is to come into awareness of the ultimate nature of reality, nothing less. It's quite wonderful. The ultimate nature of our minds, of the ground of being. Fundamentally, this practice is about an experience of that. And the teachings that Machig Labdron drew on are the teachings of the Prajna Paramita, which go back to another 1,000 years before. So the turn of the millennium, zero, our year around zero. And Prajna Paramita, Prajna means wisdom, Paramita means across the other shore. So it's transcendent wisdom. And the sense of transcendent wisdom is that it's different from knowledge, in the sense that when we have knowledge, there's sort of a knowing or a not knowing, and there's the thing we know about. And then we have knowledge of it, or maybe we don't have knowledge of it, but there's that duality, right? Even within knowledge. This wisdom is beyond that. It's beyond the shore of duality. It's a wisdom of the ground of being, of how things actually are, of our true nature. So this isn't actually a wisdom about something out there, because what the wisdom is about, it is what is in here, what is everywhere, what is the ground of everything, of every aspect of awareness, every aspect of phenomenal reality. So Prajna Paramita, when we talk about Prajna Paramita, it said Prajna Paramita is ineffable, indescribable. we can't actually describe the ground of being. We can't actually say that's it, right? Because if that's it, then what's over there? So we can't, that tendency of ours to want to grasp it does not work in this case. It's beyond concept, unconstructed, undefined. So we talk about it in terms of metaphors. And one of the classic metaphors for describing this ultimate nature of reality, ultimate nature of our minds, is space. So space, right, if we just think about space, spaciousness, space, is what allows everything to exist, right? This paper, these cushions only can be here because there's a space in which they show up. Our bodies can only move, exist because of the space that holds it. In fact, our planet, all of this is happening because there's space. But does space effort to have these objects in it? Does space work harder because we're all in it? Is space somehow constricted because now we showed up in the room? No. No. Space allows for everything, yet is completely unperturbed by anything that arises within it. Complete pure potentiality out of which everything arises and everything returns to, and all movement happens within it. There's a quality of this space, though, also, when we talk about Prajna Paramita, when we talk about the ground of being, it's not just a kind of neutral space, like if we think of outer space as sort of just hanging out there. But this is a generative space. When we talk about the ground of being, it's actually luminous, radiant, cognizant. It has energy, right? It's able to generate everything. And so the metaphor here that I love is the womb. Because why can a womb birth a child? Because it has space, right? If a womb were completely filled, a child could not be born within it. So it's space, and yet it has generative qualities. It is able to produce. So that's the quality of this spacious ground of being. And we call it luminosity or radiance. And cognizance, it has the ability to know itself. Cognizant, awake space. And so sometimes Prajna Paramita is also called the mother of the Buddhas. The sense that the mother, the genetrix, out of which the Buddhas, the wisdom of the Buddhas, can arise. So Prajna Paramita is both, it's a description of the ground of being, but it's also the description of the nature of our minds, nature of mind, the nature of our true being, who we really are, who we have always been. And I was having a conversation with my students at Naropa about mindfulness, and we were saying, well, could one always have mindfulness? You know, is that possible? And we're like, wow, it takes so much effort just to like mindfully eat a strawberry, right? Like just could I actually eat one strawberry without having 1,000 other thoughts? Like, I don't know if I could do it. And then like, could I be mindful of like everyone around me and the sky and all, you know, it was like, oh, too much, way too much. And I said, well, what if awareness is not like I'm aware of this and aware of that and aware of this and aware. What if awareness is like space? What if awareness is like space? It doesn't effort to hold anything. It doesn't effort to have numerous colors, right? What I was saying before. It isn't weighed down by the presence of movement of things going on. So our ultimate awareness, the nature of mind, is like that. Vast, open, can include everything. It is like that. Namkhai Norbu Rinpoche talks about the nature of mind like a mirror, can reflect anything and everything, the ugliest, the most beautiful, joy and sorrow. And yet does the mirror break? Is the mirror perturbed by what it mirrors? No, never. So the true nature of our being is like that. So this is from the teaching of Aryadeva. Aryadeva, the Brahmin, who was, you might say, like he was a teacher of one of Machig Labdron's teachers. And he wrote a beautiful poem on Prajna Paramita. The meaning of the Prajna Paramita, so of this wisdom of the nature of things, the meaning of the Prajna Paramita is not to be looked for elsewhere. It exists within yourself. Neither real nor endowed with characteristics, the nature of mind is the great clear light. So this is beautiful here, right? Is not to be looked for elsewhere. It exists within yourself. Right, so what's our practice then in this perfection of wisdom? How do we get there? What do we do to get it, right? So often in our lives, we feel like we start at ground zero, right? We're going to build a career, and we're going to build a family, and we're going to build a reputation, and we're going to build that edifice of me. This is not like that. We're not building it because it's always been there. So it's actually almost a reverse process. We're not building it, we're not creating it, we're not constructing it. Actually, we rest. The practice is resting in it. So Machig, in one of the beautiful new translations that Sarah just did, she says, don't search, don't practice, rest in your nature. Don't search, don't practice, rest in your nature. So it's not actually about efforting to be in this ground of being, to rest in the nature of mind. What Chöd is pointing to, that ultimate Chöd teaching, is just rest. Sounds great, doesn't it? So if it were that easy, we probably wouldn't be here. We probably wouldn't do this retreat. It's really bad marketing for a 3-day retreat. Right? So, yeah. And of course, we all know it's not that easy. You know, so I'm a mother, I work, and then sometimes I get like an afternoon where both my kids have play dates, and I'm like, I have an hour and a half, I have 2 hours, I'm gonna relax, right? From 3 to 5, I just get to rest. Okay, here we go. Now I made my cup of tea, I'm gonna sit down on the couch. Okay, now I'm gonna relax. Right? Yeah. Ain't gonna happen, right? How hard is it to relax even in like 2 hours on a Sunday afternoon? How hard is it to actually rest, right? Such beautiful teachings. It's like salve, right, to the soul. We're always searching, we're always wanting to say, no, you actually don't have to. And yet, unfortunately, it's not quite so easy most of the time. And so that's why practices have been developed. Machig said, okay, hold this. Ultimately, this is what Chöd is about. Just rest, don't practice. Just rest in your true nature. Here's another one. She says, a person of realization rests on their own ground without altering it. Without altering it. Don't have to change anything about who we are, what we do. Don't alter. But because it's not so easy, she said, here are some other techniques. So, do you want to speak a little bit more about this transition? Transition.
Passing of the baton. So there's a lot of emphasis on this resting in the nature of mind, just being. And actually, in these teachings, that's what Machig mainly talks about. The teachings of severance. She's not talking about this practice of Chöd as much as she's talking about cutting through the duality, cutting through subject-object cognition, cutting through ego clinging to the sense of self. So the Buddhist teachings of no self, right? And the way she emphasizes this, it's not so much that we are, like we often think in terms of specific practices, that we start with this practice of Chöd, and that the end goal is arriving at some realization of nature of mind. It's almost the other way around. We are starting with the realization of the non-dual. And this practice is merely the most manifest expression of that, the most actualized realization or version of that. Now, of course, we can use it the other way around. We are not always resting. So we use this practice to work, really work with duality and with specifically with the clinging to self. And why is it working with clinging to self? What is this duality that we're cutting? Very simply, because we are ejecting and cutting up this body, it's going to the heart of the matter in terms of our sense of self. Because if we look around and we think, what is the one thing that we most identify with in terms of saying, I exist as a separate entity, is the body. Because I'm not her, I'm separate, and this is my experience, this is my point of view. It starts here in the body. And so if we work with the body, offering the body, we are working very directly with that attachment to the body, and thus the attachment to self. And so it's going very much to the core of the matter of cutting through the duality. And it's challenging, it can be challenging. So in terms of these teachings, there's a continuum. In the ultimate sense, is what Charlotte is talking about. In the ultimate sense, we just rest in the ground of what already is. There's no doing. There's nothing to do. We rest. And in that resting of the view, of the vast view, there is effortless and spontaneous liberation of duality. So there's spontaneous liberation. There's not like, oh, I am seeing that and now I realize that I need to cut through. There is just resting in space. And within that view, effortlessly, things self-liberate. Thoughts self-liberate. Duality self-liberates. So that's the ultimate view. In the middle ground, there was a realization of being caught up in samsara, in dualistic thinking, being, having demons, being terrorized by things. It's a somewhat unfortunate choice of words. I didn't intend to say terrorize. It's such a loaded thing these days. But so there, we are caught in duality, and we realize that. And by realizing it, as we realize that, we cut. How do we cut? The very realization of being caught in subject-object cognition, in samsara, which is the beginning of samsara. There we go. Boom, 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 boom. Emotions follow, we get caught up. The very thought of realizing and reminding ourselves of the non-dual view, that in itself can cut. And then we rest. So that's one way. The other way in these teachings specifically is using pet, which we'll talk about more because it's in this practice. But you can use to cut through into that state of amazement and rest. That's another way of doing it. And finally, you can do the poa of this practice. You can eject consciousness with pet and eject out and then rest in the nature of mind. So those three ways of just doing chöd in the moment. It's not the ultimate sense of just resting, already realized, but it's getting caught up and then realizing and then cutting. And then in the final manifestation is this practice of chöd, where we actually sit down with our implements and our bells and our drum, and we go through this process of really working with this attachment to the body. So that's, again, the most outward manifestation. So there's this continuum. So when we do this practice, we always keep in mind that that continuum is what's behind this practice. That resting in the nature of mind is ultimately the view that this is coming from, and that this, so there's a conversation that goes on between those. There's a great quote Jigme Lingpa's Chöd that really addresses this so directly. The true nature, the great perfection, cuts the root of samsara with one stroke. I'm going to say that again. The true nature, the great perfection, cuts the root of samsara with one stroke. Thus, it transcends the cutter and the cut. But for those who enjoy elaboration and accomplishing the path of crazy wisdom activity, I will teach the pith instruction for offering one's body as food. It's a really beautiful way of saying what I was trying to explain in just one paragraph. So I'm going to hand it back to you.
Okay.
To elaborate.
Okay, so now for the Chöd, for those of us who can't just rest, even when we have our Sunday afternoon time to rest. This is the core practice of Chöd that we'll be doing. What is this about? And I think for me, my most favorite motto, Chöd motto, is a teaching that Padampa Sangye gave to Machig Labdron. So Padampa Sangye came from India and was one of Machig's teachers. And she asked him, how can I benefit beings? And he gives her this beautiful teaching, but within that is this one phrase. He says, go to the places that scare you. Go to the places that scare you. So this is really the core of the Chöd practice. Because the places that scare us are really the places where we have created some solidity of self, right? What we fear is the other. What we fear is that which is opposed to us. It's that which in some ways is threatening to our sense, our private little white picket fence of self that we're usually busy constructing. Because it's like, that's out there. What is that? What is that other? What is that enemy, that thing that doesn't agree with me? Ultimately, the demon is death, right? When everything we know we've been building up is cut away. So the ultimate demon, it is said, is death. But there are lots of sub-demons along the way, right? So to go to the places that scare you, Machig says, go towards that which you find repulsive. Go towards that which you find ugly. Go towards that which you are repelled by. Go into that rather than away, right? Our default is to pull away, to hide from it, to not want to acknowledge it, to want to get rid of it. But if ultimately, right, this ground of being we talked about, if that is our true nature, there are no walls within the ground of being. There are no hindrances along the way. So those are interesting. We go check those out in this practice. Go there. Go into them. And obviously, I think this has, Peter's already alluded to it. I think this has personal implications, it has social implications. It certainly has political implications to go to the places that scare us. And we go there with awareness and we go there with compassion. This is a deep practice of compassion. So what would that look like in our world? And I think in our time, it's a very interesting question to hold. What does that really look like for us today? This is referred to in the Chöd teachings as dulshuk. Dulshuk is a Tibetan word, and it has the sense that we lean into that which is frightening, and by leaning into it and we push through it, we actually move through fear into a place of fearlessness. Not because we didn't have fear, but because we've actually gone into our fear. We've encountered it and we've met it with compassion, and then it can release. Those of you who know Chogyam Trungpa's teachings know he teaches very much about this. Fearlessness as going into the fear and then moving through it. Namkhai Norbu Rinpoche talks about dulshuk as a way of, the dul is about training or taming and then entering into the knowledge of juk, of our true nature. So by going into that which frightens us the most, And moving through it, we actually come to an understanding of our true nature. It's almost, you might say, it's like a stalking ourselves into an experience of our true nature. So Pieter talked about this crazy wisdom activity. So the Chöpas, the traditional Chöpas, would do this practice. They really they tested that ground. Like, let's check out, let's go to those places that are really frightening. So they have these wonderful, stories of going to the scariest of places, which at that time in Tibet were charnel grounds, where people's bodies had been chopped up and were lying there. So the wild animals would come, or they'd go to wild, wild places where there really were dangerous beasts that could come kill you in the night. The Chöpas were known as these sort of liminal figures on the edge of society. They were out on their own. They'd go with a tent and their drum and their bell and an animal hide over them and ornamented with bones, right? All those things which seem so other. And they would go and they would practice in these wild places. So they were sort of not feared, but sort of looked at as these odd people, and yet they were deeply respected because they were, in times of epidemics, it was said the Chöpas were invited in because they would not get sick. Why would they not get sick? Because they could see the emptiness beneath the disease, beneath the demons. They saw through them. Whereas others would be frightened by the demonic spirits or by the disease in an epidemic. The Chöpa could go in because they saw the ultimate emptiness, the ultimate luminous spaciousness of even the most horrid thing. So, this then makes me think, what are our modern charnel grounds? And I know in our Sangha meetings we've talked about, like, what would our Chöd pilgrimages look like now? What are those places the wild places, the places we don't want to go to? Is it the dump? Is it the nuclear waste site? Is it the prisons? Where, what are those places? So, and they're outer, but they're also inner, right? I like to talk about the ghetto of the mind, the ghettos of our mind. What are those places in our own awareness and our own being that we don't want to go to? And this practice says, go there. Let's go there. Let's check it out. What happens in this practice then, as Pieter said, there's the objection of consciousness. We become Trauma, and Trauma you'll get to know her more over the course of the weekend, but she's the wrathful form of Prajna Paramita. So I talked about Prajna Paramita as the mother, right? So beautiful, so vast, so luminous in a way, but Trauma is the wrathful embodiment. And why is she wrathful? Because she cuts through, as Sarah Harding says, she cuts through the BS, right? Chöd means to sever, to cut through, as Pieter said. What are you cutting through? You're cutting through your BS. You're cutting through the dishonesty that I don't remember, don't know our true nature, which we've never been separate from. So trauma comes, we become trauma, and we're wrathful because if you want someone to cut, you want someone with a sharp knife, right? You don't want the sweet kitty cat with the nice soft paws. You want to cut well. You want the clean cut. That's what trauma is. So, and then we become trauma and we cut up our body, as Pieter said. And this is an offering. There's two parts of the body. One is the body, as Pieter was talking about, it becomes a symbol of our clinging, our small-mindedness in some way, right? Clinging to the little me, the Charlotta who's busy creating my life, right? Cuts through that. And then there's generosity. I take the body and I offer it to all beings, specifically the beings who are harm doers, evil doers, disease bringers. And in a way, it's the most generous of offerings, right? What's most precious? It's my life. Most precious is my life, my body. So I offer the most precious to those who would seemingly devour me. Completely counterintuitive, right? And then I feed them to complete satisfaction. So the beauty of this practice is everyone gets exactly what they need. So as we visualize this in the practice itself, and we've cut up our body and we've offered it, and it's in the stew, you might say, and it becomes a nectar, so that everyone who comes, that nectar turns into what they need. They need precisely to be completely satisfied. And this whole idea of need, I think, and being satisfied is very interesting, because we all have our needs and we think, oh, if I get this, then I'll be happy. And kids are great teachers in this, because they really, really want something. They really want that Lego set. And then you have this back and forth, and finally you're like, okay, you get the Lego set. And they get it. And they're so happy for about half a day. And then they need the next thing. So our toys get bigger, our needs get bigger the older we get, right? And there's that moment of like, oh, I got it, and you can feel that moment of like, oh, great, I got it, I don't need anything anymore. And then very soon it's like, oh no, actually, I need that other thing, right? The same. So in this practice, all those beings comes and they get what they need. But they get it to the point where they don't need anything, where actually all of their needs are met. And why? Because the ultimate need is to recognize our true nature, to recognize we don't need anything, that we are already Prajna Paramitas in yourself. So that's the ultimate gift in this practice, is that we give others what they think they need until they have it all, and then finally they can rest. And they just, remember we started with resting, so we end with resting. And that's really the kind of the compassionate part of this practice. It's cutting through our own clinging, and it's also an incredible sense of generosity to all beings. And that brings us to the very end of the practice.
Yeah, maybe just to relate what Charlotte was just talking about to the practice as we are going to do it in a moment. After the feeding, we'll get to a point, especially for those of you who are receiving, we'll get to a point where we will say Zokpa Chempo Maju A, and all the drumming will stop and everything will stop and it will be quiet. And that's sort of the resolution of this entire process that's happening in that moment, where we are resting in the great perfection, in the true nature. Everything dissolves in that moment. But the ones that we have been feeding are also, as Charlotte said, they are completely satisfied. So they are also resting in their true nature. And if I'm resting in my true nature and they resting in their true nature, then there's the realization that there is really nothing to fear. And there really is nothing to feed. And we just rest in that realization of the non-dual. So that's that Zokpa Chempo Majo A moment. Since I've been reading these amazing quotes, I'll end with another one of those. And then I think we'll do the practice, right? In response to her son's question, what is Chöd? Machig Labdron says, in fact, there is nothing to sever. To conquer cowardice, Chöd is explained. When you realize that everything is mind, there is no object to be severed elsewhere. When you realize mind itself as empty, severance and severer are non-dual. When you experience non-duality, there is no severing of evil. It was already cut. It is like a thief in an empty house. Okay. So we'll end there. Thank you for your attention. And now we'll do the practice.